Senator from Ohio.
Thanks, President. I thank the work that Senator Portman and Senator Blumenthal did on this. And Senator Portman and I have spent untold hours, and he was the leader in this. So I thank him for that leadership, untold hours, and especially in Toledo, Ohio, and in Cincinnati, but Toledo, where the sheriff and the community and Celia Williamson and so many others have been so important in combating this terrible, terrible affliction in our society. So I thank them. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to place the rest of my remarks in a different place in the record.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Last week, the House passed another giveaway to Wall Street, siding with special interests and rolling back accountability in some of the biggest banks at the expense of taxpayers. It comes on the heels of last year's tax giveaway that will benefit those same mega banks. This Congress bends over backwards to help Wall Street. Working families continue to struggle. Wall Street is making things worse. It's not just we're helping Wall Street with tax breaks, we're helping Wall Street with rollback of regulation. Let me outline, Mr. President, what exactly all that means. In a series over several months, I'm laying out the case for how Wall Street undermines American workers and some of the changes we need to make in this country to grow our middle class and make America make work pay off. You remember one of the points I made was that American Airlines announced that they were going to increase workers' wages, as did Chipotle, and Wall Street hit them with a lower stock price as a result. This is in each installment of this series. We've talked about these issues. I want to talk specifically this time about what Wall Street's war on workers does to employment. It's posted on my Medium page. You can follow along at medium.com/@SenatorBrown. Last time I talked about workers' paychecks. Today I want to talk about layoffs. Wall Street executives' singular focus on padding their own pockets is bad enough, but worse, it comes at the direct expense of American workers. Corporations focus almost exclusively on their quarterly performances on the stock market. It's how CEOs' performances are evaluated. They're compensated in large part with company shares. So they do better because their stock price went up, and they do things to make their stock price go up. Then they do even better because they're compensated in large part with company shares. Wall Street analysts like it when corporations minimize their costs to boost short-term profits, hence their stock price often goes up, even when the company's already profitable, and that leads directly to layoffs. Corporations lay off workers to show they are serious about cutting expenses, and their stock prices rise as a result. Wall Street's war on workers means not only smaller paychecks, but also pink slips for those workers. How do we get to a point where stock prices are more important than workers? It didn't happen overnight. Companies, I was talking to Senator Whitehouse about this a moment ago, whether it's Cranston, Rhode Island, or Mansfield, Ohio, companies used to consider their employees and their customers, even the people of the town they live in the towns they did business in, as stakeholders. You cared about your community. You cared about your workers. You cared about your customers. They felt a duty to fulfill obligations to a broader community, not just their own corporate board members and their own top executives. I grew up in Mansfield, Ohio, a city of about 50,000 in north central Ohio, halfway between our state's two largest cities, Cleveland and Columbus. And I remember there were so many companies in our town, and these I didn't know these company presidents. They were really big people in town. I was a kid. But I do remember that what those companies did. They sponsored Little League teams. They were involved in the local Kiwanis Club, the executives. They cared about their workers. They cared about the community. They cared about their customers. They weren't always only interested in shareholders. They were interested in stakeholders, in all of us as a community. All the workers, all the customers, all the community were stakeholders. But now the focus is narrowed to just shareholders. As Wall Street's influence has grown, corporate priorities have shifted from shareholders kind of writ large, and the way success is measured has changed fundamentally to stockholders. Businesses have become beholden to those quarterly earnings reports. They've left employees, communities, and customers behind in many ways. They do everything possible, including laying off workers, to make sure their balance sheets and profit margins look as good as they can. The impact on workers or the long-term health of the company be damned. In the 1980s, investors began to pursue hostile takeovers of companies that failed to maximize profits to the most ruthless extent. Executives at other companies began to fear takeovers if they didn't keep profits and stock prices high. And the pay packages of top management went greater and greater and greater and became more and more closely tied to short-term stock performance. Wall Street's and Main Street's interests began to diverge. Folks in the corporate boardroom were no longer forced to consider what's in the long-term interests of their workers and of their small-time investors. For top corporate executives, workers became nothing more than a line item in the budget, a cost to be minimized. By the 1990s, even profitable companies started laying off workers to boost profits even further. Look at what happened to Xerox, an iconic American company, never had a major layoff in its history. 1993, the company announced plans to cut 10,000 workers despite being profitable. The company was doing fine. It wasn't the case of an industry moving south, facing an agonizing decision and bad options, but the CEO justified the job cuts as necessary, quote, to compete effectively and to have a lean and flexible organization. He said he expected to see higher profits because of the layoffs the following year. Xerox wasn't alone. In the first 10 months of 1998, when the economy was booming, corporations laid off 500,000 U.S. workers, 200,000 that were laid off the year before. This is the definition of profits before people, and things have gotten worse and worse since the late 90s. 2015, Cisco announced a 3-year plan that included reducing its workforce, corporate speak for laying off workers. Might have made sense if the company had experienced a year of sluggish sales, but guess what? The opposite was true. Their sales had increased. They generated $1 billion in cash flow. They were able to pay $700 million in dividends to the company's shareholders. And if the large dividend payout the year before wasn't generous enough, the CEO said one of the goals of the 3-year plan and its layoffs was to maximize shareholder returns. Not stakeholders, not employees, not the community, not the customers, but shareholder returns. The next year in 2016, Tyson's Food announced layoffs despite having a good quarter in beef sales. The following year, the company's president touted exceptional financial results. The reason for those results? Cost cutting. It's always cost cutting. Again, more corporate speak for laying off workers. You know what else he cited as evidence of the company's good health? Not great sales, not new products, not investment in new ventures in more workers. No, the ability of the company to buy back billions of dollars of its own stock. So an accounting trick that funnels money to executives is what the company cited as a measure of success. Buying back means executive compensation goes back. That was the key to what it was doing with cost cutting. The company buys up shares of its own stock to drive up the price and increase value for shareholders and the compensation for executives whose pay is tied to stock performance. Sounds familiar. It's no coincidence, since the biggest corporations reaped their tax windfall in December, they've announced $200 billion in stock buybacks. It's always about the executives. It's about the executives' tax cuts. It's about the executives' compensation. It's about the executives' buyback. Again and again, we see Wall Street considers workers as simply a cost to be cut, but executive pay is essential to a company. Humana last year announced it was eliminating 2,700 jobs despite $13 billion in revenue. The same call where the CEO announced the layoffs, he also announced an increase in executive pay. Workers lose their jobs to pay for more money for corporate executives. Sound familiar? Again and again and again. The cherry on top, a month later, Humana announced $3 billion in stock buybacks. Again, what's that about? Higher executive compensation. Of course, cost-cutting measures typically include workers losing their jobs. Cost-cutting measures almost never include pay cuts for corporate executives. Each of these examples, the company decided cost cuts were so necessary they had to fire workers and upend thousands of lives. And I wonder, Mr. President, how many of those executives, how many of those corporate leaders actually brought some of those workers into their office and looked them in the eye and told them they were laying off? My guess is they had some much lesser paid employee make that announcement and face the media, and more importantly, face those employees who lost their jobs. And how many of these executives actually listen to the story of an employee who loses her job, then loses her house as it's foreclosed on, whose total life is upended. How many of them ever really listen to those stories of what happened to workers that get fired? The company decided cost cuts were so necessary, they had to fire those workers. The short-sighted approach to running a company may work for top executives who can squeeze as much value out of the company in the short term without considering the business's long-term value. So it's not just bad for the employees and the communities, it's usually bad for the long-term health of the company. Making short-term decisions pays off if you're already well paid, but it doesn't work for those employees. Main Street investors and workers only make a profit when a company's stock market continues to rise over time. But executives in the corporate boardroom are no longer forced to consider what's in the long-term interests of workers and small-time investors. As long as Wall Street's analysis, one-size-fits-all measure of corporate success continues to be cost-cutting, workers are at a constant risk of losing their jobs. As long as CEOs get paid based on stock prices instead of a company's long-term success, workers will keep getting fired at profitable companies. We need to break this cycle of greed between Wall Street and CEOs. Companies, in the end, can't be profitable without good workers. We need policies that restructure our economy so workers share in the profits they create. Wall Street doesn't determine when workers keep their jobs or how much is in their paychecks. I yield the floor.